Greetings, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhno. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and right now I'll be presenting to all of you our esteemed English-speaking auditory, actually English-speaking review on Ukrainian battle map situation as of July the 7th. So please join and watch this video, like it, share it, subscribe, and leave your comments below. I will start with one interesting image which shows us some really interesting UAV statistics. So let's start with that. I'll explain everything in the next 15 or 20 minutes. Be with us.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
So what do we see in this photo that I'm showing you now? This is a report from the Drone Forces Group for the 24-hour period from the 5th of July to the 6th of July. That is from 18 o'clock on Saturday to 18 o'clock on Sunday. These images show, and now the Drone Forces Group submits such daily reports, in fact, every single day. We can then calculate what effectiveness, what share of overall effectiveness in the general picture, let's put it that way, that the general staff reports to us is played by the drone forces. And to get ahead of myself, I'll say that this role has increased tremendously. This role is extremely significant. It is extremely important. And as of 1 month since the formation of the Unmanned Systems Force Group, which I already mentioned last week at the end, and now I'm adding to that, the total number of enemy targets hit by this group is now about 20%. In other words, every fifth target on the front is struck specifically by our unmanned units, specifically as part of the Unmanned Systems Force Group. And about every third occupier is hit in the same way. Every third, every fourth, so roughly every 3.5 occupiers are struck specifically by the Unmanned Systems Force Group. Here, in fact, we see in this photo an image once again with the statistics, the daily statistics of the Unmanned Systems Force Group. I've highlighted 3 points. The first, which is very important, is the points of departure of the occupiers, or rather the pilots of the occupation forces. 18 points have been hit, with 1 point completely destroyed. Completely destroyed means it was bombed to nothing. 18 points have been hit. Since Vidarr took charge of the drone forces, that's when this whole story developed, namely that he now has political tools, let's put it that, because one way or another, the former commander of the drone forces, Vadim Sukarevsky, simply didn't have the kind of political tools that Vidarr does. But this in no way diminishes the achievements of Robert Brody, in the sense that, he has done a truly fantastic job of building, or rather continues to build the work and sets up all the right, let's call them, mechanisms within the drone forces that are exactly as they should. And one of his first decisions was to increase the importance coefficient for neutralizing enemy UAV operators, both those operating strike drones and reconnaissance drones. And now we see that in a single day, striking 18 targets exclusively by the drone forces group is a significant achievement. The next category I highlighted is the enemy's cannons and howitzers. 24 of them were hit, with 2 destroyed. But I wouldn't pay special attention to this, because this is basically the style of Magyar's birds. They usually don't destroy cannons completely, because there's simply no need for it. They target their barrels. A little drone flies straight into the occupier's barrel, which basically leads to damage to the barrel of the cannon or howitzer. And this, in turn, simply creates even more problems for the Russians. Why even more problems? In fact, a damaged cannon is actually better than a destroyed one. Let me explain why. Because in order to destroy a cannon, you have to come up with something, think of a way to hit it at just the right moment, for example, when it's loaded, or in some other way, or when there are some gunpowder charges or shells nearby. To hit it, all you need is a single drone that flies into the barrel and damages it. That's it. The cannon is out of order, the barrel can fire, it's no longer capable of shooting. This means that now this whole machine, the cannon, has to somehow be hauled away from the front. This requires spending some logistical resources if the occupiers even bother to repair it at all. Because if they don't, then a damaged cannon is as good as a destroyed one. But if they do decide to repair it, then it has to be pulled back from the front. And again, as I've already mentioned, they'll have to use some of their logistical resources for this, some trucks, some tractors, whatever they have. It needs to be pulled from the front, sent somewhere to a repair base. A new barrel has to be manufactured, then deliver to that base again using their logistical capabilities and resources, and the battle has to be replaced. So essentially, this turns into a very complicated hassle, which leads to the fact that a damaged gun is either equivalent to a destroyed gun, or it becomes a major headache for the Russian Federation in terms of destroying guns. And this number, in fact, is significant: 24 guns. Every day we observe more than 30 guns, which means that the unmanned systems have essentially taken on the main striking force against the enemy's artillery system. The third point is, of course, the personnel of the Russian occupation army. 127 occupiers have been hit, 73 killed in action, and 54 wounded. So these numbers are actually very, very good, very important, and very positive. The fact is, friends, that I will continue to provide some education on why drones are important and how they have changed the course of the war. Although I think that pretty much everyone understands this, I will continue to provide this kind of education because these are very important things to discuss and to understand why it's necessary to donate to drones, why the government is making certain investments in this area, and why it's important for there to be joint ventures and investments, including from abroad. Because drones, in essence, have rewritten the current or old system of warfare. They have completely eliminated such a component as logistics. Logistics is now the first thing to have suffered from modern drones, and this is just the first warning sign. Because UAVs haven't just changed tactics, I repeat, they are changing the components, certain elements of warfare. After all, logistics at the front now is not the same as it was in 2022. From 2022 to 2025, it has made a truly tectonic leap, as they say. Previously, logistics was all about mileage, the number of trucks, the fuel you needed for those trucks. That was what logistics was. But now, logistics is essentially a full-fledged combat operation. In fact, it's a much more difficult combat operation than, for example, an assault sometimes, as our soldiers say, even harder than directly storming positions. Because this combat operation is carried out under the cover of the fact that drones from both sides are involved in the schema, in the formula of eyes plus, as Vidarr says, the sting, or eyes plus strike. That is, a reconnaissance drone detects everything that moves and everything that needs to be hit, and then an FPV drone delivers the strike, or a bomber drone drops its payload. So this configuration essentially creates a completely total gray zone, a kill zone, a continuous area where it is impossible to travel on roads, to carry out logistics, making logistics impossible. Logistics has now become one of the most vulnerable parts of the front. The combination of drones is transforming it and, in fact, bringing the classic supply scheme to its knees. And essentially, this whole logistics story, which is a major component of the defense forces or in general of global military strategies, is being knocked out. That's why right now ground robotic systems are playing a very important role as they are taking on the brunt of this main logistical challenge. Currently, there are simply dozens on every section of the front, dozens of so-called roads of death. The occupiers, the Russians, use them to send their soldiers. Yes, they die there in droves, in absolutely massive numbers. But in general, these roads of death, for example, made up of our destroyed equipment, they also exist on our side, as a matter of fact. Because moving through every intersection where, for example, drones are lying in wait for you, what do the Russians do with, let's say, an FPV drone on fiber optic cable? Imagine that this is an FPV drone on a fiber optic cable. They place it at busy intersections where they know vehicles are passing through. They set it down and switch it to standby mode, that is sleep mode. They wait for a car to come by, and when the vehicle approaches, the drone takes off. Boom, that's it. There's no car left, nor the likely driver. And those who were inside also suffered serious injuries and wounds. And in fact, logistics now requires just as much effort as any assault. It's a full-fledged military operation. That's why drones are drastically changing the system. And I am very pleased that at least now Vidarr has even the political opportunities to improve the capabilities of unmanned systems, to implement those solutions that are now extremely necessary for the front, because it's simply, well, our reality for survival. Because we can survive within an army of drones, not an army of infantry. That's how it is right now. That's why this logistical drone-based explanation I just gave personally convinces me that, for example, in the Kherson region, it's not just that we shouldn't expect any enemy operations, but it's actually unrealistic to expect them. It's really unrealistic. Because with the current capabilities, resources, and realities, it's almost unimaginable that anyone could manage to cross the Dnipro River in the Kherson region. And that's precisely because of this destruction of logistics. Now we're not even talking about 10 or 15 kilometers anymore. Now we're talking about 20, 30, 40, even 60, and up to 100 kilometers, which drones are flying over and covering these areas. So in this sense, the south is a completely hopeless option. There really isn't any scenario in which an assault across the Dnipro is possible. And that's exactly why from here, from the Kherson direction, 2 weeks ago, the occupiers began partially transferring some of their reserves to the Sumy direction. The same situation is now being observed in Zaporizhzhia, and yesterday it was reported by the head of the Center for the Study of Occupation, Petro Andriushenko, who showed that from the Zaporizhzhia direction, another convoy of enemy equipment consisting of 20 units, 20 trucks transporting personnel moving in transit from Mariupol to Taganrog and Rostov. Among them, there are also some individuals of Caucasian nationality who have been identified. So this could be representatives of Ahmad. Where are they headed? Once again, from Zaporizhzhia through Mariupol to Taganrog and Rostov, and from there they will travel by rail to the Sumy region, to the northern front. Here is another video, for example, which also captures this convoy. Here we immediately see two interpretations of what is happening, two perspectives that I am now presenting to you, friends. So the first perspective shows that this lack of prospects in Zaporizhzhia and generally in the south is truly felt by the occupiers. On the other hand, the question arises, why are the Russians then redeploying their troops to the Sumy direction? And here we come to the next very interesting answer. All regular viewers of this YouTube channel, my channel, and my reviews of the battle map will confirm that a month ago, day after day, I kept saying that there is no immediate threat to Sumy with the current enemy troop grouping. There is none. For Sumy, there is no prospect for the Russians to advance further than 10 kilometers from the state border towards Sumy, which is exactly what we are seeing now after all. At the point where the enemy advanced a bit deeper towards Yunakivka, well, that's 12 kilometers. And even now, it's not even 12 anymore. In fact, what did the occupiers encounter? Let's count on our fingers. They were stopped on the Sumy direction. They suffered colossal losses on the Sumy direction. Now, over the past 2 weeks, the defense forces have been conducting counteroffensive action. And I mentioned this last week as well. I'll repeat. These offensive actions, Kindrativka, Oleksivka, Andriivka, Yabyablunivka, Yunakivka, and the settlement of Seydi. Here, in all these places, our troops carried out successful counteractions. That is, the Russians were stopped, deprived of a significant portion of their manpower resources, and began to retreat. This is the current outlook for the enemy on the Sumy axis. A month ago, even 2 months ago, I said that 50,000 troops are simply not enough for a full-scale offensive on Sumy, for blocking the Sumy logistics routes that they want to cut off. For such a large-scale operation, you need at least 150,000 troops, if not more. Not to mention the occupation of Sumy, which Russian propagandists fantasized about and tried to plant in the minds of our information consumers. And these propagandists were saying that it would be possible to occupy Sumy. That is impossible under the current scenario. Accordingly, finding themselves in a situation where their advance was halted and they began to retreat with colossal losses, the Russians now need reinforcements. Where are these reinforcements coming from? From areas with no prospect. Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and potentially, possibly, according to rumors, the first reinforcements expected here could come from North Korean troops, as was mentioned last week. But overall, the situation in the Sumy region right now is, well, far from ideal. They are finding themselves in quite a difficult situation. On the other hand, the Russians are now trying to launch a so-called retaliatory strike. And last week, after advancing in this area to the settlement of Mimilov and occupying it, they are creating, well, this has been discussed over and over. They are creating potential pressure on our logistical routes between Bili, Kolodiaz, Prikolotne, and Veliki Berlu. And essentially, their connection with Vovchansk and the link to Kupiansk and Voreshna. Accordingly, this advance that the enemy has now secured creates pressure on these highways. Pressure, once again, from drones. Drone warfare, we keep coming back to it. And overall pressure on the Kupiansk axis, because once again, our regular viewers will back me up on this. I said a month ago, actually more than a month ago, that the main objective of the enemy during the summer-autumn campaign is the East Donetsk and Luhansk region. The secondary mission is not Sumy, not Kherson, not Zaporizhzhia. The secondary mission is specifically Kupiansk. That is, to advance precisely there. And now on the Lyman-Kupiansk axis, we are witnessing a rather significant intensification of hostilities. I would also now today on the 7th of July, just as I did on the 19th, I think, of June, 3 weeks ago when I said that in this area, where the Russians have now taken Milov, there would be an intensification of hostilities. I would now draw attention, as suggested by the excellent press officer, now former, as I understand, height of the Kramatorsk border detachment within the State Border Guard Service, with the call sign Kornilov. Vlad Kornilov is his call sign. He says that there are now significant preconditions for the Russians to possibly begin an offensive on the settlement of Detyarne. And in fact, in the long run, to try to cut off this entire salient between Vovchansk and the now occupied settlement of Milov. That is, there are currently rather significant and dangerous trends for this salient, indicating that the occupiers might start something similar to the Sumy operation here, with the aim of establishing a small buffer zone. Therefore, this definitely needs to be paid attention to. And that's why I'm emphasizing this today during the review of the battle map, because I'll be covering the Donbas only minimally, since the situation there strategically hasn't really changed. But in the Kharkiv region, new risks are emerging that need to be watched closely. They must be. We understand that as a result of the information pressure regarding the Sumy region, the occupier has to some extent achieved its goal by creating information pressure there, generating public demand, requirements, and attention toward the Sumy region. He essentially lulled the tension away from the Kharkiv direction. And this needs to be addressed, at least in my opinion. I want to be wrong. I would like to see an effective repulsion of these attacks in the future. We'll see. Maybe I really am mistaken. But overall, the pressure on the Kupiansk-Lyman axis, is very significant. This pressure, in fact, well, on the broader right flank of Kupiansk has significantly intensified across the entire Lyman front as a result of the weekend. The Lyman front essentially has now come in second place in terms of the number of assaults by the enemy. And here, the Russians are very actively using their anarcho-motorcyclists. Here, the 60th Brigade shows how the motorcyclists ride in to storm. But before they even reach their target, and upon hearing our drones, they simply drop down, get off their motorcycles, and hide in the woods. But then they are destroyed. Both the motorcycles and the occupiers themselves in this wooded area are destroyed by our drones. Accordingly, there are a lot of such assaults on motorcycles now, because, as we always say, we should not underestimate this enemy tactic, since it does yield certain results. But on the other hand, with the existence of kill zone drones right now, these are drone bombs, bombers, and before that there were FPV drones. So these offensives are simply neutralized and turned into a bloodbath. Here's another video. These are now the soldiers of the 63rd Mechanized Brigade in the area of the settlement of Torske, showing how they stopped the enemy using mines, drones, and aerial reconnaissance, how they destroyed enemy vehicles, which were also abandoned. And then, well, I'm actually cutting these shots because YouTube censors them, showing how the occupiers' infantry is destroyed. So in other words, the pressure has significantly increased right now, specifically on the Kupiansk-Lyman axis. And I have every reason to believe that this week we will see an intensification of fighting, specifically in the Kharkiv region. We'll see whether I'm right or not. But as of today, this trend seems quite likely. With this trend, we enter this new week. Thank you for your attention, friends. Take care. All the best.